Before viewing video lessons, it is important to read the textbook using the learning guide as your turn-by-turn directions. Then use the learning guide to take organized notes in your own words with examples and pictures. Chapter 1, Psychology's Modern History. So far, we have discussed the early schools of psychology of structuralism, functionalism, psychoanalytic behaviorism, and humanism. Now we're going to discuss the modern schools of psychology. All schools of psychology seek to define what psychology is and how we should study it. Before we talk about the 5 more modern views, I need to talk about an important event that impacted the history of psychology. From the beginning of psychology in 1879, all the way up through about the 1940s, psychologists were focused on those 5 early schools of psychology. Most of their work was in a laboratory, doing research, theorizing, trying to basically figure people out. Then, World War II happened. And World War II was very different from wars we have today. During World War II, every person in our country contributed to the war effort in whatever way they were capable. This was the era of Rosie the Riveter, so the women went to the factories while the men went to war. Children collected scrap metal to be used in manufacturing materials for the soldiers, and psychologists were no different. However, simply sitting in a laboratory doing research and theorizing wasn't very helpful, and so what we needed was applied psychology. Psychology is the scientific study of human and animal behavior. That's what we had been doing for quite a while. But it's also the application of that scientific knowledge to solve practical problems. And applied psychology was born during World War II. Essentially, psychology had 2 different problems they tried to help the military with. The first problem the military had was they were getting hundreds and thousands of recruits every day and had no easy way to figure out which recruits were best suited for which positions. So the field of industrial organizational psychology was born, and what they did was they created a test that could quickly screen the military recruits and assign them to the positions that would work out best for them. This test still exists today. In fact, some of you may have taken it. If you have ever heard of or taken the ASVAB, that's the modern day version of the test industrial organizational psychologists created for World War II. Now, psychology saw one other problem they could be helpful with, and that was that many soldiers were experiencing a problem called battle fatigue. Today, we would call this acute stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. What we know about war is that from the beginning of time, war has been hard on people both physically and psychologically. Before modern medicine, so many people died on the battlefield that the psychological injuries were not always obvious because most of the soldiers ended up dead on the battlefield. But with modern medicine and modern protective gear like helmets and things like that, we had many more soldiers surviving traumatic experiences physically, but who were damaged psychologically. And so the applied field of clinical psychology was born during World War II, and its purpose was to treat soldiers and try to prevent battle fatigue. After World War II, the psychologists, the soldiers, everyone came back home, And these fields continued both in the military, but also in the civilian sector. So the industrial organizational psychologists went to work for business and industry, doing the same thing and then expanding later on. The field of clinical psychology continued as well and grew exponentially. In 1946, we had the National Mental Health Act. This created the National Institute of Mental Health, which provided funding for science and, most importantly, practice. And there was lots of funding available for training clinical psychologists. However, psychology is still trying to define itself. So we'll continue into psychology's more modern history, or psychology after 1950. One trend that developed after 1950 was a trend focused on cognition. Jean Piaget was one of the most prominent cognitive psychologists. The cognitive psychologist said that we should apply these scientific methods that were very well developed by the behaviorists who only studied observable behaviors and events. They said we can take those same scientific methods and apply them to studying internal mental events. They said that while I cannot see your thoughts, you can make them observable by saying them or writing them down or answering a question about your thoughts. And so cognitive psychologists used some very good hard science that was developed by the behaviorists to study something that can be made observable, which are your thoughts, how you make decisions, how you learn and understand the world. Another perspective that began in the 1950s was the biological perspective. Now this one sort of takes us back to some of our ancient roots in terms of how we understood behavior, that sort of physiological understanding. Only now we're going to use more modern tools and techniques for understanding the biological and the psychological. So the biological perspective said that we could understand psychology by looking at your physiological processes. And in particular, the biological perspective focuses on the function and structure of the nervous system, the endocrine system, and also the immune system. Now, psychology, like many other sciences, to include medicine, has a problem. And that is scientists in all fields have been ethnocentric. Ethnocentric is the tendency to view one's own group as superior and as the standard for judging. So as a result, the early psychologists tended to view psychology and view their study of psychology from their own limited cultural perspective. And they tended to judge all others based on their culture. If you noticed in previous reviews of the main figures in psychology, we had an awful lot of white men. And those white men were fairly well-to-do in their time because they were able to go to college, and not everybody was able to go to college. And so essentially what we had were a lot of middle and upper class white males studying middle and upper class white males, telling everybody else that we should be just like them. Now, while I would love to be like Bill Gates in many, many ways, I don't think he is the standard by which we should judge everyone in the world. So as a result, the cultural perspective of psychology began in the 1980s. If this seems a little bit late for us to sort of get this sense that maybe we ought to take cultural differences into account, You should know that this same perspective didn't crop up in medicine until around the same time. So in the world of medicine, we had lots and lots of research on one cultural group, one racial group, one gender, that we then applied to everybody else. So in psychology, the cultural perspective specifically focuses on how cultural group factors influence behavior. In part, the 1980s pushed us to do this because we had a growing global interdependence. We had an increased recognition of cultural diversity within our own culture, and we began to recognize that we're not all exactly the same. Another school of psychology is the evolutionary school of psychology. Evolutionary psychology takes the principles that you've learned about from evolution and apply them specifically to psychology. And what they say is that natural selection occurs for behavioral as well as physical characteristics. Natural selection works by focusing on things that increase survival and reproduction. If you manage to live and reproduce, your traits will get passed on. If you don't, those traits will leave the genome and leave the species. The modern day version of evolutionary psychology began in the 1980s with several researchers, and they focused on the natural selection of behaviors that enhanced reproductive success and survival in our ancestors to help explain how people are today. They looked specifically at mating behaviors to include who you choose to date and marry, sexual behaviors and jealousy, also aggression, and aggression and mating sometimes go hand in hand. They also focused a lot on development, how we parent, how language develops, how we make decisions, how our personality traits develop. And they looked at how that happens in the context of what worked for our ancestors. The final modern school of psychology is the most recent, and this is the positive psychology movement. This began in 1997 with Martin Seligman's epiphany, as described in your textbook. Positive psychology basically says that we should not focus on how people are broke when we're trying to study psychology, but we should instead focus on what works, what helps people be functional. And so it applies scientific methods to understand the positive, creative, and fulfilling aspects of human existence. They focus on three key things. They focus on subjective experiences. Subjective experiences would be your own view of your experiences. They focus on individual traits, such as optimism versus pessimism. They also look at how we structure and how our institutions and communities function, and how sometimes that helps and enhances our existence and our functionality, and of course sometimes it doesn't help so much. Some of the basic ideas of positive psychology remind us of humanism. The biggest difference between humanism and positive psychology is that positive psychology had a focus on using scientific methods to understand how we can be our best selves. So over the course of the history of psychology, which began as a formal science in 1979, we have been struggling to define what is psychology and how exactly we should study it. So these 10 schools have been our effort over the last 100+ years to figure this out. In a future video lesson, we'll look at the current view of what is psychology and how we should study it.